The year is over, my friends, and while it sure wasn't perfect, it certainly wasn't the nightmare that was 2020. At the tail end of last year, I did a video where I sort of reviewed the dozen or so games that came out that year that I managed to get my hands on in between all the waiting for work to start back up again, the family quizzes, the gaining and losing weight, the heightened anxiety, you know, all that good stuff. And despite that video not being hugely successful when compared to my other works, and the video quality making me want to throw up at the graininess of it all, I enjoyed getting to do something a little more simple than I'm used to, along with getting to stretch my critiquing muscles a bit. So I decided to go at it again, mostly because I owe you all a lot more content than I promised for this year, which I'll sort of go over towards the end of the video. I will admit that this year's video won't be as polished or as well structured as last year's, with some games just getting a quick summary here and there, but I will however be covering just about all the games I got to play this year, whether they came out in 2021 or from almost a decade ago. As of last year's video, not all games got to be completed, with me only bringing up the incomplete ones if I feel I had a good enough understanding of the game by this point, hence why I've left out games like Xenoblade Chronicles and Tales of Berseria. Anywho, hope you all enjoy me rambling on for the next 14 minutes on a mishmash of current to random games from the past 10 years. Oh yeah, and once again, here's a bunch of games that came out this year that I hope to get around to one of these days. So then, first off, rather than starting with a game, we're actually going to talk about a console instead. Yes, after spending several weeks monitoring PS5 stock accounts on Twitter, attempting multiple times to land a Q spot, and after shilling out the extra cash for a bundle that included an extra controller and 2 games, one of which I still haven't got around to, I managed to land a PS5 midway through the year. I won't deny that after the frustration of the Red Ring of Death on the original 360 and the high price and limited games at launch PS3, I swore off ever getting a console within the first 12 to 16 months of its release, unless of course a certain game franchise that I adore just so happened to come out within that time frame, and that we sadly live in a world where I just couldn't avoid having spoilers lobbed at me over the web. So yeah, I caved in, but thankfully, so far at least, there haven't been any real technical concerns outside of reports of analog sticks drifting, so I'm hopeful this will not come back to haunt me anytime soon. Knock on wood. Now I will admit, I'm not exactly tech savvy enough to go into any deep dives into the many internal hardware related improvements for the console, but I will say however that the controller is something that I think gives it an edge above most other current gen options at this time. There are a lot of amazing moments I've played in the last few months that have been greatly amplified by all the realistic feedback that the DualSense provides. The haptic feedback that can perfectly simulate the texture of the surface your character is walking on, the triggers that tighten when firing a weapon with a lot of kick to it, the sound that emits from your controller as your character performs tasks like typing away on a keyboard. It just adds so much that every time I see a PS5 box in store, I look at the back to see if it uses all the features instead of just your standard rumble. While playing my second run of Borderlands 3 with the free PS5 upgrade, there were a good number of weapons I kept on me just because of how good they felt to use. If I was Sony, I'd have a team dedicated to helping other devs see about implementing these features into other last gen games like Resident Evil 2 Remake, Metal Gear Solid 5, Nier Automata, which could better distinguish them from the Series X and its own use of smart delivery. The PS5 SSD is also mind-blowing at how fast it can boot up games compared to the last gen, in particular the games I've played so far that have been overseen by PlayStation Studios. I'm half certain I've had sneezes that have lasted longer than it takes to get from the home screen to actually playing in Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Not every new addition to the PS5, however, is great though. The home menu interface doesn't follow the natural jump the PS4 made from the PS3, with the easy to navigate selection bar now being split into multiple areas that take way too many different turns just to get to where you need to go. Some recent updates have allowed for players to customize things like moving the power option to the very front of the PS option bar, as well as removing applications we don't need from it. But then we have things like folders for our games and the option to view all installed games on the front page still not being available for us at this time. We can also only have one file downloading at a time now. There's only 825 gigabytes of internal storage space, with roughly 150 of that being kept in reserve for future updates. But more importantly, people, we still can't choose how to organise our trophy lists. The console's shape is also a mixed bag. While I do think the shape they went with does exert this power to it, and unlike the Series X, if I were to walk into a friend's room for the first time, I'd instantly recognise it, but the sheer size of it along with its rather flimsy stand makes it awkward to move about as someone who's constantly plugging in different consoles in and out all the time. To flip back over to the positives, I should probably talk about some of the games that best showcase the system's highlights I listed off. The first ones I need easy one to get, as every PS5 has Astro's Playroom already pre-installed onto it. Here we not only get a decent 3D platformer that celebrates the history of PlayStation, but we are also given many opportunities to test the DualSense along with the instant load times. It's not the deepest platformer ever when compared to the excellent Astrobot's Mission on PSVR a few years back, but as free games go, it's very fulfilling. Plus, gotta give them credit for having a final boss that's even more obscure than Polygon Man. Next, I guess I should talk about the game that got me to buy the console so soon into its life cycle. I've made it clear by now that despite dipping away from the series for a bit during their PS3 outings, I've still remained a die-hard fan of the Ratchet & Clank series. I love the colourful universe they inhabit, the characters are still charming as ever, and the weapons still find ways to be creative. With many flagship Sony properties still remaining on the PS4, most likely due to the continued PS5 shortages lasting well into the next few years or so, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart has done what it can to prove that it could only have accomplished the feats it set itself while running exclusively on current-gen consoles. The rift topping is, as to be expected, one of the game's biggest features, with you being able to move from different sides of the map as well as other locations seamlessly. The journey of our two heroes is, as many of you may have noticed, very different this time around, with the introduction of a new playable character named Rivet. And while gameplay-wise, the two Lomexes are as different as night and 5 minutes later, the story does find ways to go into topics that we really don't see in many games, let alone Ratchet & Clank. I will say that while the worlds are able to tell gripping individual stories that work off each of the heroes' own conflicting issues, I do wish that our heroes' own stories had been a tad more, well, riveting. Both Lomexes can also feel a tad too similar personality-wise as well, which is odd considering the stark differences between each one's universe. Any hints at different traits from Rivet, like a limited trust or slight bias against robots, is sort of swept under the rug almost instantly. While there aren't a huge number of worlds this time, almost each one brings with it new mechanics and are all very lively and stuffed with detail in them, though some of the more open maps do tend to show some cracks around the edges, so to speak. The weapons, to little surprise, are once again extremely creative, and as I mentioned, are given even more life breathed into them thanks to the DualSense this time around. I still do wish the gadgets were given as much love nowadays as they were back in the original PS2 trilogy. Hell, I'll do you one better and ask for at least the minimum effort from Up Your Arsenal alone if you like. But at the very least, we do get a lot of callbacks to both PS2 and PS3 eras, with many allies and enemies returning, along with tons of references to Easter eggs to other related franchises. For those of you wondering, I do have plans to cover this game in a best to worst list later down the line. I just figured waiting a tad bit until more of you actually have a PS5 to play this game on. I don't really believe in the term killer app, as the idea of buying a whole gaming console or handheld just for one game has always seemed a little ridiculous to me, but Rift Apart is an easy recommendation to start your PS5 off with. Even if you never picked the series up or just fell off over the years, this is still an easy point to jump in and get lost in another excellent adventure. I won't say it's my favourite, that still goes to 2, but it definitely falls into the top half of the series for me. But let's talk about the other Insomniac game I got to play this year. While I could have easily played this on my PS4 last year, Spider-Man Miles Morales seemed like a good enough game to compare with last gen, with things like its stunning visuals and faster loading times being key selling points on the PS5. Spider-Man Miles Morales isn't exactly a huge upgrade from the original game, with this city having only slight changes to it, but the combat has been given a bit of a boost thanks to the addition of Miles' unique electrical abilities, along with a few original gadgets to his arsenal. What's more, the animators have done a bang-up job doing what they can to give Miles' web-slinging and fighting style its own unique flavour, with wildly different animations compared to the more experienced Peter Parker. There's something just so mesmerising about the imperfection how Miles is still learning while also adding his own flair to it at the same time. The story is sadly just alright when compared to the monster of a journey we went on with Peter, with one of the villains coming off as more idiotic than complex, while the other is as run-of-the-mill as they come. That said, I think they do a really good job of spreading this message of community and doing what you can to help those less fortunate. On a smaller note, I've got to say I'm definitely not a fan of the redesigned Peter, who looks just way too similar to Tom Holland now, but he's only in it briefly and I guess I'll have to wait till next game to see if I'll just learn to ignore it. Speaking of which, I can't say there's much here that looks to be leading into the upcoming Spider-Man 2 in 2023, other than maybe the continuation of Miles' journey to form his own identity. It's not the most thrilling ride, nor is it the longest, but I still think it's worth checking out if you're already hooked on these adventures. One of the more bizarre circumstances in gaming this year was that of Arcane Studios' Deathloop coming out exclusively on PS5 for console, for the first 12 months at least, despite Arcane having been acquired by Microsoft thanks to their purchase of Bethesda back in March of this year. Sure, exclusivity contracts don't just vanish once you've been bought up, but considering the time between the two announcements, it's just a weird shift in direction is all. Anyway, while my interest was beginning to wane a bit leading up to Deathloop's release, mostly due to it feeling a little too over-promoted. Once everyone started throwing out full 10 out of 10 scores for it, I figured there might actually be something special here. Games that revolve around looping events are not exactly uncommon as they were 5 or so years ago, but Deathloop does manage to do an admirable job at telling an interesting story surrounding this one mechanic, at least until things start to get a little too samey. The banter, for instance, between protagonist Colt and nemesis Juliana, excellently performed by Jason E. Kelly and Osamar Kaga, starts out very humorous and entertaining, but cut to 6 hours later, and I'm now wishing the two would actually talk less to one another. Locations, weapons, mechanics, and mission objectives also begin to rapidly slow down over time, with there being fewer and fewer surprises till the game's eventual conclusion. Which even then, I must say, is not exactly phenomenal, as they go for one of those "what has your experience playing our game taught you" kind of endings, except I honestly never really gave much thought about what I was doing on my journey, so when the moment came and went, I felt a little indifferent on how it ended for me. Also, I felt the start of the game did way too much hand-holding. I think I would have liked it more had I gotten to discover things like infusing items by myself. The online component to the game, with other players invading your runs as Juliana, does add a lot of suspense to your runs as Colt, with you failing to either kill or escape them, resulting in you having to restart the day's run, and possibly lose valuable weapons, slabs, and trinkets you've received. As for playing as Juliana, it's fine, I guess. There's weapons, trinkets, and costumes that can be earned by checking off certain tasks, but unless they introduce crossplay, I don't see you managing to find many matches within the next few months, seeing as I spend most of my time waiting at the loading screen for someone's game to invade. I feel that I should also note that during my playthrough that began after the 1.0 patch, I ran into multiple technical issues that really dampened my enjoyment of the game. While I don't have footage of them, my problems range from freezing when entering the menu right after finding a clue, to not being able to leave the loadout screen even after I restarted the day, to it just randomly freezing while I was in the process of gaining a rare trinket. As much as I don't like to rag on others' experience compared to my own, I do find it hard to believe I happened to end up with so many game crashes as I did, while it seems many reviewer outlets came out mostly unscathed, it seemed. Naturally, after this kept happening to me, I eventually left the game until the next update turned up, hopefully to fix said faults, only for them to mostly just improve on the enemy AI and the online components. Still, I decided to just power through it all the same, seeing as I was just a ways off completing it. For as much praise has been heaped on for it, I'd say Deathloop is about on the same grade as Arcane's other games, Dishonored and Dishonored 2. I haven't played the Prey reboot, so I have no idea what it's like. Both series have interesting and stylish worlds with fun mechanics, but still feel like they're missing something important that helps land them that A-tier list of games. There are probably some games right now that are escaping my mind that use time looping mechanics a lot better, but it still makes for a mostly unique and entertaining experience. While I wish certain parts of the game had been brushed up on a bit, it's possible, like so many others it seems, you may either not even notice them, or just be so enamored of everything else to really care. Next, let's switch from a game in which you're forced to endure a never-ending cycle of live, die, repeat, to a game with almost the exact same premise. Telltale's Housemarque's transition from flashy arcade shoot-em-ups to much more higher budgeted story-driven games after their last few titles failed to pick up much traction, Returnal, while certainly aiming for that cinematic flair, still manages to lean into the studio's aptitude for fast-paced action coming at you from all sides, with you gradually finding ways to upgrade your weapons and character stats as threats continue to grow more and more deadlier. At face first value, I will admit that there are plenty of elements that one could easily link to other more well-known properties, from the Giga-esque design and colour palettes to the unknown and understanding of new alien species in Ted Channing's Story of Your Life, but the game does find ways to forge its own identity, mostly from its exploration into the psychological trauma of our protagonist, Celine. The gameplay, for ways of sensibly shoot aliens, move to the next room and repeat, manages to include a number of differing weapons with rotating alt fires to them, along with bonus abilities, items to obtain, stat boosters. Also, you can strive for that best build you can that suits your playstyle, until getting knocked back down to the start once again. I'll be blunt and say that this game is not the most calming or even the most rewarding roguelike on the market, as there are very few resources that you're able to keep with you upon death, along with only a few shortcuts to help you reach already visited areas on the planet. The lack of any supporting characters to interact with also ties into this, with many runs becoming very emotional and motivationally draining. There were more than a few times that I thought back to how Hades managed this and was able to make defeat not seem like you had just wasted almost an hour of your time. The many rules and mechanics of the game was something that, despite having the option to look back at past instructions took me a good while to comprehend it all, making me wish that I had an instructional guide included in my game box, rather than relying on the research logged ones that were included in the game. I will say that after watching 2 tip-based videos on the game, along with finally getting to overcome the first boss, it did start to quickly turn around for me as I got to fight in less cramped zones, along with a wider variety of weapons and gadgets available. If you're into these sorts of flashy, quick-paced shooters like Doom or Control, then chances are you're going to have a great time here, especially with how much the DualSense gets to show off. It does require a lot of patience, and even with the recent update allowing players to save mid-run, you're going to be stressed out quite a bit from it all. I'll probably finish it up sometime this year once I've played through a few games that are a bit more on the cheerful and chillax side and contain a wide assortment of colourful characters, which this next game could easily fill out just on its own. It's been a long wait for many of us, whether it be since the original's release back in 2005 or just the sequel's announcement at the 2016 Game Awards. But at long last, Psychonauts 2 was released to us this year, and it was very much worth the wait. There's a lot of growing pressure on how one does a 3D platformer by today's standards, with even those working on the next Mario game probably nervous about how to improve on a formula that could very well reach its limit any day now, along with their target audience more focused on competitive and community-based games than the less laid-back personal experienced ones. With the original Psychonauts spending quite a while in the oven, Double Fine's first title unfortunately came out at the tail end of when the genre was slowing its wheels to a crawl, which certainly proved to be a shame as it was able to not only provide a captivating and delightful journey, but also found ways to interpret mental stresses and conditions that can last with us for years on end. Psychonauts 2 manages to dive even deeper than I imagined they could have, creating a number of worlds and characters that are both charming as ever, while also finding ways to come off even more multi-layered than I could have hoped for. Tim Schafer and his team have really outdone themselves this time, cementing Double Fine as one of the industry's most talented and a worthy addition to Microsoft's arsenal. Much of the platforming in Psychonauts can seem rather standard, but even then, despite a few familiar mechanics or ideas having been done before, it's the ways in which the levels, powers, stories and characters are all woven together that make this an experience that I've just had such a blast with. The writing and characters are especially the most delightful aspect of Psychonauts 2 for me. I got so giddy whenever a new character was introduced, and there were so many great lines that I even started writing them down after a while. Combat has seen much improvement from last time, with your normal attacks and powers being able to flow together much easier this time as you go up against a variety of mental obstacles. I do wish, however, that we were given a wider gap of immunity after being hit, and that maybe the radius on enemies' attacks was shrunk down a tad so they were easier to dodge. If I have one big issue, it's with how, rather than pulling back, Double Fine seemed to have, well, doubled down on the many collectibles including the sequel, which was already a tad overwhelming the first time round. Now admittedly I have not completed this game yet, which has been in part due to the lack of free time I've had, but also just my own personal need to savour this great journey. I don't want to leave exploring every nook and cranny till the end, I want to do it now. So if you even have to ask, I highly recommend getting this game. Despite Microsoft buying the publishing rights, it is still available on all modern gaming platforms, minus Switch, but hopefully that might change soon. It's just a pure joy to play and a welcoming sight to a sequel to one of gaming's most beloved hidden gems being given a second chance and managing to land almost perfectly. One of the most hyped up indie titles of the year was that of Kena Bridge of Spirits, which since its reveal at PlayStation's Future of Gaming event has seen many make comparisons from its art style and quality animation to that of big budgeted 3D animated movies. While Ember Labs, the studio behind Kena, has mostly worked on ads over the years, outside of a short based on Majora's Mask, Kena marks the studio's first steps into the games industry. It doesn't take a hedge fund manager to tell you that switching courses like this and putting all your money and hopes on an art form that you and your studio likely only have a fraction of experience with is a big gamble. Thankfully though, Kena does manage to come out of the tunnel mostly unscathed while only picking up a few dents and scratches along the way. The attention to detail that Ember Labs has put into the vegetation and lighting throughout the lands surrounding the sacred mountain is undeniably remarkable, especially in how quickly it all morphs once you've healed an area of corruption. There are amazing vistas that just ooze life and really give you reason to help heal this land. Admittedly, there are plenty of mechanics and tropes in Kena that take clear influence from other games that many of you can draw your own lines to. While I adore this game's presentation, it's not without a few minor and sadly major flaws tucked away in the gameplay. Platforming can seem pretty standard, combat starts off slow but gradually adds new layers and strategies, and puzzles can at times seem a little too basic. The big exception I find to this is whenever your powers are needed to be incorporated, which are done in very inventive and satisfying ways. If there's one major misstep, it's in how most of the fights against the tougher enemies can really upset the relaxing mood the atmosphere brings with it. There's rarely any problems when going up against the smaller enemies grouped up, but it can get aggravatingly difficult when faced with one of the more bulkier foes who can cut down your health bar within but a few strikes. You can try to parry attacks, but it's a very small window for the type of game it's trying to be, and you don't get much of a tell when the attacks are about to land. Honestly, the first few of these stressful fights really began to sour a lot of what I loved about this game. It was like getting to have one of the best 3-course meals of the last few years of your life, only to be suddenly be dropped in your first night of Fight Club. With that said, by the time I was approaching the final act, I did begin to figure out different strategies for each of them, thanks to the assortment of powers I had accumulated by this point. I still do wish, however, things had been toned down for the combat by a bit, or at the very least for the platforming to match it. I certainly recommend players who aren't necessarily looking for a challenge to play through it on easy first, especially if you're not one for the same kind of parrying usually found in a Souls game. Finding and herding the adorable little spiritual creatures known as the Rot can be a real joy as your herd of companions grows larger by each new edition, along with getting to customize them with different hats and masks. I do kind of wish we got a bit more variety than just different sizes to them, but it's still an amazing part of your journey. This game is a fine introduction for Ember Lab, showcasing the team's strengths, but also outlining where things likely need to improve going forward if this is indeed the direction the team is headed from now on. Visually, it's amazing to look at with some neat mechanics introduced, but sadly it still feels like it's lagging behind by a decade or so in some areas. It's not a long game, but I'm very much okay with this. It means I have more reason to come back more often and get to enjoy all the artistic wonderment from start to finish again. One game that I was going to skip out on for this video due to having only picked it up recently, but decided to add it in at the last minute, was Metroid Dread. This game certainly became a pleaser for fans of the franchise, as it was not only originally planned for the DS back in the day, only to seemingly be put through the ringer due to design hurdles, but was also the first new 2D Metroid game to come out in almost 2 decades. After playing a handful of games for the franchise, I've come to the conclusion that I'm much more of a fan of the first-person design Metroid games, but despite that, I've still gotten a lot of enjoyment from this title. The environments and most of the enemies are very classic Metroid, but are still really well detailed and give this planet a lot of life and personality, even if I still do find it a little hard to distinguish it from some of the many other abandoned worlds Samus has been to in the past. Much of the gameplay takes the refined build from the 3DS as Samus returns and builds on it with some new movement options, but its biggest addition is that of the moments where stealth plays an important factor, as we do what we can to make our way through marked zones while avoiding confrontation with the almost indestructible EMMIs. Over time, we are able to remove these Terminator-like obstacles, which, while satisfying, can start to get a little repetitive with only slight improvements on their tactics and upgrades as we progress. There are some tropes of the series that I do wish could have been a tad reworked this time around, such as the progression in which we acquire our weapons and abilities, akin to a link between worlds, or even going for a more character-focused story this time, which I know, by saying that, may cause some of you to have flashes to other M right now. I don't mind the minimal storytelling, but I do wish our only ally through this game, this AI named Adam, had some personality to them, so at least I could have an easier time focusing on the exposition they keep dumping on us. I'm just saying, it's hard to root for any Metroid representation in Smash Bros when there are no other iconic characters to pitch. The inability to switch button layouts was also a big annoyance for me personally, but I did learn to deal with it eventually. Despite all this, I wanted to be clear that I'm still enjoying the game and am eager to explore every corner of the map and see what this all leads up to for Samus. I'm aware the story has more to it than I'm describing, so maybe I just need to wait a little longer for things to really get flipped upside down. Collecting abilities is always a satisfying feeling, and the boss fights outside of the MMIs are really flashy while still remaining as tense as they've always been. If you're a Metroid fan, then well, you've most likely beaten the game 3 times by now already, but if you're someone who hasn't gotten the opportunity to try out the series yet, it's an easy enough game to start off with that contains many of the same pillars used throughout the series run. Okay, we've still got a lot more to go through, so from here on out we're just going to try and power through the rest. First up, a game that I was very likely a good ways off from ever thinking of picking it up, but after hearing others label it as an underground hit of 2019, and with the enhanced PS5 version coming out for PlayStation Plus this year, I figured I'd at least give it a try and see if it was worth the hype. A Plague Tale: Innocence is certainly an odd title to find, having been worked on by a studio best known for developing Disney titles and previous gen games for those who still haven't transferred over yet. However, it's clear that Abzû Studios really gave everything to this project, with much resembling the same quality you'd expect from a more AAA studio, to such areas as lighting, performance, textures, and the, well, rather disturbing rat physics. Yeah, that last bit was what warded me and likely many others off from this game, but after slowly becoming numb to all the swarming, the devouring, the bursting out from the ground, the haptic feedback, the cries of the unimaginable pain from your enemies, I managed to really get hooked on the story of these estranged siblings and their journey through this dark as hell time period. This is most definitely not an optimistic game if it wasn't clear enough. I actually questioned what the mental state was like for many of the staff who had to work on anything related to the game's art, especially when I got to the level where our protagonist had to cross a day-old battlefield with thousands of rotting corpse used to decorate it. Now, though this game isn't what I'd call one of the most flexible stealth games, it is easily one of the most unique in terms of the mechanics it slowly builds around itself, with the rats acting as mostly an obstacle from the start of the game, then gradually being used to your advantage in some situations. While combat is best kept as a backup in case stealth fails you, there are a few moments towards the end that it becomes a requirement for you to fight, and it's not great. This one bit near the end was causing me to continuously drop points off this game, and before you say it, I asked others about this part and I was not alone. If you want a decent stealth game with a well-told story set in easily one of the grittiest worlds imaginable that will make you want to outline the Middle Ages as a big no-no for time travelling locations, then it's worth taking a look, if you're not too squeamish that is. Trust me, it gets pretty damn dark. Now, on to a much more soothing game about being surrounded by nature's gift to us. Abzû was a beautiful aquatic adventure that makes for a colourful and wondrous look at the many creatures living in the big deep blue, all while relying on visual storytelling and the environment to expand upon the lore of the world. Serious props for providing what feels like just about all the fish, as well as those few non-fish folk floating around here and there. Each one is animated and designed to near perfection, helping to give each chapter almost a different palette of paint each time. One issue that is hard to ignore is how much it feels like it borrows too much from 2013's Journey, which many of the team at Giant Squid had played a huge role in whilst at that game company. Not only do both games create similar moods, but both also have us build a spiritual connection as we progress, to us then eventually falling, only to rise as we near the end. Even the music, though excellently composed by Austin Wintory, can have a few tracks that I could mistake for his earlier work. Still, it's a relaxing and immersive game and I still recommend when it's on sale. I can't really agree with the price given how short it is. While Abzû might have been designed to, pun intended, test the waters out at Giant Squid, their next title, The Pathless, would prove that they were more than a one-trick pony. Though we see a few staples from the team retained, such as a forgotten civilization being lost to time, or how once again we find ourselves connecting with the spiritual side of the world and are attempting to mend it in some way. What is strikingly different for the team this time is how the game incorporates combat elements along with a more open-ended world for players to explore. It's very refreshing to have a game like The Pathless where we just need to pick a direction and not necessarily follow a marker or a map to move forward. We've seen similar approaches to letting players navigate the world with little to no hand-holding as seen in games like Breath of the Wild or The Outer Wilds. Travelling across the enormous lands, whether on foot or in the air, can feel really freeing and keeps players focused by having them maintain momentum as they fire arrows into floating talismans scattered throughout. The threat of the corrupted spirits can really take you by surprise as they happen to teleport their red storms right near you all of a sudden, with the only options being either to attempt to run or seek out decent shelter. Getting caught in them is visually really tense as they hunt for you, but once you know that all you'll suffer is a small amount of crystals you've collected, you may only care if you're eager to level up your ego as much as you can. The puzzles are a mixed bag as they have a good number of ideas behind them, it's just that they range from decently creative to just matching symbols on a wall, plus you'll be getting a lot of deja vu as you begin to see ideas get repeated with only slight variations to them. What does cover for this, of course, is the freedom we're given to discover each of them along with a soothing presentation. The score also manages to cover both the tranquil feeling of crossing the lands as well as the ferocity to each one of the corrupted spirits boss fights. To me, this was the game that set Giant Squid apart from that game company, as they were able to both retain the beauty and the escapism they had already perfected while managing to layer it over gameplay that complements the game's simplicity, at least when you're not solving your 6th match the symbol puzzle. One game that I all of a sudden had a craving to play for the first time this year was the truly bizarre but delightful remaster to the original Katamari Damacy. Even after all these years, there's still nothing quite like the Katamari series, in its premise, in its art style, and in its simple yet strategic gameplay. Admittedly, the controls can take about an hour or so to fully get used to, but after that, it's smooth rolling from here on out, at least until the camera gets stuck on something. The way the insanity builds is really effective at getting you to reach that next level or high score, all while accompanied by a groovy soundtrack. It's a shame that it's just the first game that's been remastered here, but it's still a worthwhile title if, like me, you knew the series growing up, but just wasn't as experimental as you are nowadays. And now we switch over to what I like to call the, alright, I did start that, didn't I? section of games. For starters, let's look at the oldest game to make its way on here first. I honestly don't know why I never sought out either sequels to the PS1 classic Ape Escape during my golden years of video gaming. Maybe it's because back then I tended to rent most of my games first and bought them afterwards, and I guess neither game seemed to appear or catch my eye while on store shelves near where I lived. It's hard to tell by this point. I don't know how I would have reacted to the second game back then, but after having finished it after a small hiatus back in 2017, man, where does it all go? Anyways, while I do think I would have had a great time with it, I can't say I would have been whisked away as much as I had been with all the other platformers I was in love with around that time, or even compared to my first time playing the original for that matter. Ape Escape 2 manages to make the transition over to the PS2 well enough, certainly better than how Crash and Spyro started off to be sure, with some colourful environments, smooth animations, and fun collective on gameplay to it. And yet, a lot of what's here can feel like they just remade most of the first game, with a few new additions here and there. Only 3 new gadgets are introduced. Outside of the first few, many of the locations share too many similarities as the previous ones. Hell, even the final battle looks like they just copied from last time. These aren't the worst sins a game can have pinned on them, as long as they're still fun of course, but just like with Super Mario Galaxy 2 or Rayman Legends, both of which I really enjoyed, I wish I could have gone to have seen something that impressed me just as much as the previous games they'd built on achieved. We do get a lot more boss fights this time, all of which are pretty creative, and the monkeys even add some additional personality to each level thanks to the multiple costumes they can be found dressed up in. I'm still glad I played it and eventually completed it. I just hope the third game steps things up a bit more when I get around to it. One game that I'm especially ashamed to have kept on hold for so long is the indie classic Fez. To many gamers and developers, Fez has stood the test of time as one of the industry's shining examples of what can happen when you push yourself to achieve your dream game, even when you're forced to carry so much of the weight of its development on top of your own shoulders. The game's creator, Phil Fish, certainly made a name for himself both for and after Fez's release. As made evident in the documentary Indie Game the Movie, Fez is him. His identity is linked to this game as if it were his own child. So, needless to say, one could spend a whole lot of time trying to deconstruct it all to see if it reveals anything deeper about him, or you could just take it as a very well-made platformer with a comforting retro gaming aesthetic, along with a very simplistic but geniusly implemented core mechanic. And maybe I just wasn't paying all that much attention, but I definitely found it hard to uncover any real hidden meaning behind it all. Then again, maybe these expectations are just a byproduct to come from almost 10 years of other studios creating their own vague personal tales. All the same, it's a cheap, easy to play platformer that as of April can now be played on almost all modern consoles. Really? I honestly can't think of an excuse as to why you shouldn't have gotten this game by now. Another platformer that I played for a bit but then got around to completing 4 years later was Media Monocle's Tearaway Unfolded. Like so many others, I missed out on picking up a Vita for a multitude of reasons, so I was glad that one of the most unique and highly praised titles for it was given a console port, though so I hear it sadly did little to rake in much extra dough. It's easy to see how much effort and creativity the team at Media Monocle spent on everything, from the plants to the creatures to the locations. This was more than just creating a simple platformer and then dropping a paper-like filter over the world. If it's paper and it can be folded, they found a use for it here. But even with this unique art direction, the game spends a good portion of time allowing players to create their own interpretation to things like a crown, a snowflake, the head of a scarecrow, the logo to a high-tech laboratory. All of this can be over and done with within a few seconds if you want to, or it could be something you take your time with and craft a piece of work that is very you. As to be expected with the Vita's features now mostly gone, the PS4 controller has to compensate with you using things like the touchpad to direct the flow of the wind, or use the motion controls to simulate shining the light bar within the world. Unfortunately, a lot of that can get drowned out with the game's combat that really slows things down as you try to dispatch each of the various types of enemies throughout different means as they all gang up on you. As unchallenging as it might be with there being no penalties for constantly dying, it still felt very frustrating to get the hang of, and as I was nearing the end, I just kept using the easy solution, which was usually just getting them to run off the side. What is there of the story also feels all over the place at times, like they cut out levels from the original then stuck in new ones that just didn't match the flow of the story. It's a really creative world with some inventive and interactive platforming that we don't get to see as often as I'd like. The combat might weigh things down towards the second half, but like I said, everything around it is still a delight to witness as you feel the love the devs had for this title. Okay, so there is one old game on here that I didn't start years ago, but I still have been sitting on for quite some time now. When I heard that Catherine was one of those games that even hardcore completionists shudder at, I did sort of scoff at the idea of it being that hard of a game, and Yeah, no, this game kicked my ass to the point I knew halfway through that continuing to play on medium difficulty was probably going to drive me insane eventually. To paraphrase Game Maker's toolkit, a good puzzle game has the player confronted with a problem that can be seen as impossible, but eventually be resolved by players thinking from all angles instead of one, and discovering or rediscovering rules and techniques that are right in front of them. And needless to say, Catherine has a lot of options at how players can accomplish their goals, to the point that even when I wasn't playing the game, I still had its simple yet complex mechanics still living in my head rent-free for a time. It's a very strategic and improvised-like game, what is essentially just moving blocks of various attributes around so as to climb further up and move even more blocks. It got so infectious that all of the stuff outside the puzzles felt more like a distraction to me rather than a nice way to cool off. Maybe it's my rather bare dating profile, but I can't say I was engaged that much over which Catherine to choose from as others may have been. Maybe it was the fact that they both felt like they were just there for me to choose between two different lifestyles and never really allowed me to get to know them as, well, people. It should be noted that, if the frame rate drops during the boss climbs wasn't evident enough, I was playing the original game, and the full body version that came out a few years back does take a few different twists with the story, as well as a third love interest into the mix. Needless to say, despite the story not fully grabbing my attention, this game was still thoroughly entertaining and was a very different experience from the game director to Personas 3 to 5. I recommend checking out for the addictive puzzles alone. Continuing on from the theme of puzzle games that explore our dating life, Maquette tells a story of a relationship forming and slowly crumbling, all while we the players solve unique puzzles through differing environments based on memories from the couple's time together and how they in turn look back on them. The mechanics of dropping or removing objects from a miniaturized version of a set you're standing in, while it itself is just a model of its own, can easily work as a metaphor for how we look back at our past memories from differing perspectives, looking back at our happiest memories together while also highlighting those we feel displayed our toxicity to one another. Some puzzles work better than others, but the ones that flip your perspective I particularly enjoyed. The story is admittedly not as profound as it probably could have been, with the dialogue between the two leads starting off just a little too sweet for my taste, but credit where credit is due, the way they write the descent of the relationship as well as the overall conclusion was handled very well. While this game certainly isn't that long to complete, it manages to utilise its unique physics-based puzzles to the fullest, all while paired with a decently written story to go with it. And lastly guys, we have Everyone's Gone to the Rapture. This is also a game I've had on me for an overly long time now. I never started, but unlike Catherine, I just never knew the right time or frame of mind to give it a go. It turns out though, the time was right after getting back after an exhausting day, and the frame of mind was just in the mood for a gripping yet calming short story. Now there's a lot that I'm about to talk about with this game that could very easily have you mark it down as a hard pass right away. This is not a game in which we, the player, affect the world much at all, to the point that rotating your controller so as to tune these balls of light are really the most gameplay we get from this title. It's the way it tells its story, however, by having us seek out these echoes of the past, that Everyone's Gone to the Rapture allows for us to truly feel immersed in this journey and experience something that I haven't felt for some time now. These settings and these characters really struck a chord with me, as I was easily able to tie many of them to the same kind of habitat I'd lived in for just about my entire life. In a way, you are investigating this abandoned, quaint northwest English village, but instead of having a notebook to cross off clues or objectives, you instead just have to find and listen to these moments from these since departed inhabitants and make the connection between them all on your own. The developers did add in these balls of light that roam throughout that can lead you to some of the more important moments for each character, which to me I see as them realizing that most players needed a little bit of help to push them in the right direction. The lighting, the voice acting, and especially the music done excellently by the game's director Jessica Curry really keeps you on edge for a game that you can tell isn't going to throw you for a loop all of a sudden and have you gunning down aliens during the game's climax. I'm pretty sure the last game that got me to block out the outside world and had me fixed to the screen for so long was Journey, all the way back in 2013. It's always the quiet ones, it seems. This most definitely won't be a game for everyone. There's no puzzles to solve, no way to interact with the world outside of opening doors and gates. Even what constitutes for a run button is instead more of just a brisk power walk button. If you're someone who tenses up whenever a game is labelled as a walking simulator by some, then I can't say this game will change your opinion, but if you feel like taking a chance with it, I recommend following a similar approach I did and play it when you know you have 3 hours to yourself with zero outside distractions getting in the way. because sometimes we just need to escape reality when it keeps breaking our doors down. This last year for me, while bringing with it many high points like my channel hitting over 2,000 subscribers, unfortunately faltered big time when it came to the amount of content I'd hoped to have produced and released by the year's end. As I mentioned, these kinds of videos, while certainly not the kind of stuff to be hitting the thousands in views, are still a helpful reminder about what I love to do the most in life, and that's talking about video games, whether I'm praising them, semi-harshly criticizing them, helping to spread awareness of them to more or less informed gamers, to just geeking out over the effort the developers have put into their stories, worlds and technical achievements. I said at the beginning that this video was most likely going to be a bit of a downgrade compared to last year's, and yet I still couldn't force myself to half-ass any of these titles. It's just not in my nature, it seems. Despite other content still being in the works at this time, which I really hope to be out early this year, this video kinda did need to happen, I think, for my own sake at least. Will I keep doing them every year? Hard to say, but they do help to wind down during what I, and I'm sure many of you as well, consider to be the most stressful time of the year. So anyways, thank you all again for your continued support of me and my channel. And was there any game this year, new or old, that helped you escape the madness? As always, till next time.